The O'Drivens had been observing humanity for centuries, their advanced technology allowing them to watch from the farthest reaches of space, hidden from human eyes. They were a species who valued logic and efficiency, who saw death as the ultimate threat to existence. To them, life was a series of calculations, an endless pursuit of survival. The concept of death as anything more than a problem to be solved was foreign. They had conquered it long ago through their advanced biological processes, ensuring they lived for millennia. But humans were different. For the O'Drivens, humanity's attitude toward death was a puzzle they couldn't crack. Unlike any other species they had encountered, humans didn't fear death in the same way. It wasn't that they weren't afraid. Rather, they seemed to accept it. They faced it head-on, with courage, defiance, and sometimes even with a sense of peace. To the O'Drivens, this was a mystery, a paradox that intrigued and confounded them. To investigate this anomaly, the O'Drivens began an experiment, one that would unfold over decades. They observed humanity from the shadows, slipping in and out of Earth's atmosphere unnoticed, collecting data on how humans interacted with the concept of death. They analyzed every funeral, every soldier's last stand, every person who had faced death with no hope of survival. They watched the survivors, the ones left behind. They watched as families grieved, as friends held each other in their darkest moments, and they began to see a pattern emerge. The O'Drivens discovered something unexpected. It wasn't death that terrified humans, it was loss. Loss of loved ones, of companions, of the bonds that made life meaningful. The true horror wasn't in dying, but in the idea of leaving those they cared about behind. It was the emptiness that followed after a loved one was gone. This realization sent a ripple through the O'Drivens' collective consciousness. They had never considered love, connection, or relationships as central to existence. In their long lives, they had grown distant from such emotions, viewing them as distractions. But humans seemed to believe that their connections to each other were the very essence of what made life worth living. And so, the O'Drivens' interest deepened. They needed to understand why humans valued these bonds so deeply, to the point where they would willingly face death to preserve them. Why did they risk their lives, fight wars, endure suffering, all for the sake of others? What made them so different from every other species they had studied? As they delved further, the O'Drivens began to witness acts of heroism and sacrifice that left them stunned. A soldier, wounded on the battlefield, would still fight to protect their comrades. A parent would risk everything to save their child, even knowing the cost. Time and time again, the O'Drivens observed humans walking toward death, not out of fear or recklessness, but because they could not bear the thought of losing those they loved. The mystery deepened with every passing year. The O'Drivens knew they were on the brink of discovering something profound, something that could change everything they thought they knew about life, about existence, and perhaps even about themselves. But they weren't ready to reveal themselves just yet. They needed more data, more answers. The humans weren't just curious beings anymore. They were a riddle, and the O'Drivens were determined to solve it. But what would happen when humanity discovered they were being watched? That was a question the O'Drivens didn't yet have an answer for. The O'Drivens, now more intrigued than ever by the human capacity for selflessness, decided to conduct an experiment, a test to confirm their theory. They had watched humans face death without fear, but now they wanted to see how far they would go for one another. Would they sacrifice everything, even their own lives, to protect the ones they loved? To set the stage, they subtly manipulated a group of astronauts, sending them on a deep space mission to a distant galaxy. The crew was composed of the best and brightest of humanity, scientists, engineers, and military personnel, tasked with exploring uncharted space. Among them was a married couple, Sarah and Luke, both experienced astronauts. Sarah was the mission's medical officer, while Luke was a pilot. Together, they represented the best of human collaboration, a bond forged over years of trust and shared experiences. The mission was supposed to be routine, a simple survey of a newly discovered star system. But the O'Drivens had other plans. They intentionally introduced a flaw into the spacecraft's navigation system, a glitch that went unnoticed during pre-launch checks. When the crew was already light years away from Earth, the system malfunctioned, sending the ship off course toward a dangerous asteroid field. In the chaos that followed, an unthinkable accident occurred. Luke's spacesuit was breached during an emergency spacewalk, and he was left floating outside the ship, unable to make it back before the life support systems failed. The O'Drivens observed the scene from their hidden vantage point, waiting for the inevitable. The crew would panic, or they would be forced to choose who would survive. The situation was dire, and yet the crew didn't give in to despair. As they scrambled to make repairs, it became clear that the only way to save Luke was for someone to perform a risky spacewalk to bring him back. But the time was running out. There was no way for two people to survive in the small airlock long enough to make the necessary repairs. One of them would have to make the ultimate sacrifice. Sarah, having been Luke's partner for years, made her decision immediately. She knew that if she didn't act, he would die. She also knew that if she went outside to help him, her life expectancy would be limited. There was no way to return safely. But there was no hesitation in her voice when she volunteered. "I'll do it," she said, her words steady despite the dire situation. "I can save him. I won't let him die out there alone." The crew tried to dissuade her. They argued, begged, even tried to override her decision. But Sarah was resolute. She would risk everything to bring Luke back. With a final, desperate kiss shared through the glass of the airlock, Sarah stepped into the void, pushing herself toward her husband. The O'Drivens, who had been monitoring the situation, felt a shift, something they hadn't predicted. As Sarah made her way toward Luke, her pulse racing, and the cold vacuum of space closing in, the O'Drivens saw something they had never encountered. True, unyielding love in the face of certain death. They couldn't understand it. In their long history, no species had ever displayed such a willingness to give up their own survival for another. As Sarah reached Luke, she performed a quick maneuver to tether him and return him to the airlock. But it was clear that neither of them would survive the journey back. As they entered the airlock together, the oxygen levels were rapidly depleting. With only seconds left, Sarah and Luke exchanged a final look, a look that said everything they needed to say. The O'Drivens saw the deep bond between them, an unspoken promise of eternal connection, even as death loomed. When the airlock doors closed, the crew could only watch as the life signs of both Sarah and Luke flatlined. They had succeeded in saving each other, but at the cost of their own lives. The O'Drivens, left in stunned silence, realized they had discovered something far more complex than they had ever anticipated. Humans didn't fear death in the way they had expected. What humans feared was not their own death, but the loss of those they loved. The O'Drivens were left reeling after the sacrifice of Sarah and Luke. Their experiment had shown them something profound, but it also left them with more questions than answers. The decision to give one's life for another was something the O'Drivens had never encountered, and it rattled their cold, logical worldview. They had seen humans face death before, but never with such depth. The O'Drivens couldn't comprehend what they had witnessed, and it unsettled them. With their theory now solidified, humans feared the loss of those they loved more than death itself. The O'Drivens decided to escalate their experiment. If they were to truly understand this overwhelming attachment, they needed to test the limits of human emotion. They devised a plan to create a situation so dire, so desperate, that it would force humans to choose between their own survival and the survival of the people they loved. They initiated a galaxy-wide conflict, manipulating tensions between the human colonies scattered across distant planets. The O'Drivens sowed seeds of division and distrust, manipulating both sides into a full-scale war. The war raged across light years, with entire fleets of human ships clashing in the void of space. The O'Drivens watched, fascinated by the way humans fought, not for conquest or glory, but for the safety of their families and friends. Even in the midst of the chaos, the bonds between loved ones were evident. Among the soldiers was Captain Jace, a veteran of the human military who had seen countless battles and suffered personal loss. His squadron had been tasked with a critical mission: to secure a strategic outpost that was being overrun by enemy forces. However, when Jace received word that his wife, Emily, a medical officer on a nearby colony, was caught in the crossfire of an attack, he was faced with an agonizing decision. The O'Drivens had expected Jace to prioritize the mission. They expected him to be loyal to his comrades, to do whatever it took to complete the operation. But instead, Jace disobeyed orders. His personal connection to his wife trumped the needs of the war effort. Without hesitation, he chose to leave his post and rush to her side, knowing full well the consequences could be dire, not just for him, but for the entire fleet. The O'Drivens watched in shock as Jace's decision unfolded. This was a choice they hadn't predicted. They had anticipated that humans would act out of duty, that they would prioritize survival over personal connections, but Jace's actions revealed something else entirely. Love and loyalty were worth more to him than any military objective. When Jace arrived at the colony, the situation was grim. The enemy had already breached the outer defenses, and the remaining survivors were scattered, desperately trying to fend off the invasion. But Jace didn't hesitate. He fought through the chaos to reach the medical facility where Emily was stationed. When he found her, wounded but alive, they shared a brief, powerful moment. Emily's eyes filled with tears as she reached out to him, not knowing if they would survive the oncoming assault. Together, they fought to evacuate the injured, making a stand against the enemy forces that had overwhelmed the colony. Jace knew they might not make it out alive, but he had no regrets. In that moment, with Emily by his side, he had everything he needed. The O'Drivens, observing this scene, began to understand something essential about humanity. They didn't just fear loss. They'd fought for it. Their strength, their will to survive, wasn't based on the instinct to preserve themselves, but to preserve the ones they loved. The O'Drivens' experiment had taken an unexpected turn. It wasn't just that humans feared death. It was that they were willing to sacrifice themselves, to risk everything, for the people they held dear. The galaxy, torn by war, had become a stage for the most powerful human emotion of all: love. And the O'Drivens were beginning to realize that this was something they could never have. The O'Drivens had seen enough to know that the emotional bonds between humans were unlike anything they had ever encountered. The concept of love, sacrifice, and loyalty was starting to shake their understanding of humanity. But they weren't satisfied. They needed to know just how far humans could be pushed, how much suffering they could endure, and whether they would still fight to protect each other when faced with an overwhelming, seemingly unbeatable threat. So they took their experiment to the next level. The O'Drivens unleashed a biological plague that spread across human colonies at an alarming rate. It wasn't just any disease. It was engineered to cause panic and despair, to rip apart families and communities. As the plague spread, entire cities fell into chaos, with millions falling ill, unable to even comprehend the origin of the disease. The O'Drivens watched from their hidden vantage points as the situation spiraled out of control. The disease did not discriminate. It attacked the strong and the weak, the old and the young. Whole families were wiped out in a matter of days. The O'Drivens observed the human response with growing curiosity. They expected fear, hysteria, and selfishness. They expected people to prioritize their own survival over everything else. But instead, they saw something they hadn't anticipated: compassion. Communities came together, organizing impromptu shelters and medical care units to treat the infected. People volunteered to care for their neighbors, regardless of the risk to themselves. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and yet human volunteers stood beside doctors and nurses, offering whatever they could to help save the sick. It was a strange, powerful phenomenon. Despite the inevitability of death, despite the overwhelming odds, humans clung to each other in the face of despair. Captain Jace, who had survived the earlier battle with his wife Emily, found himself back on the front lines of a different war, this time against the plague. Emily had been diagnosed with the disease, and although she was gravely ill, Jace refused to leave her side. The disease was spreading quickly, and the medical teams were overwhelmed. Jace, ever the protector, knew that Emily's chances of survival were slim, but he couldn't bear the thought of losing her. They shared an isolated cabin in the middle of a quarantine zone, surrounded by the sick and dying. As Jace sat beside Emily, holding her hand, he couldn't help but think about the lengths he would go to save her. He had already defied death once for her. Would he do it again? As the days passed, the situation grew more dire. The plague showed no signs of slowing, and the death toll mounted. Yet, despite the endless suffering around them, Jace and Emily never gave up. They were part of a larger effort to bring together the last remnants of human civilization, to create a network of survivors. And although they both knew that they might not survive, they continued their work, not because they were certain of the future, but because they refused to let the fear of death stop them from protecting what mattered most, each other. The Odravens, watching from afar, could not understand the strength that drove the humans. In the face of death, they did not give up or flee. They leaned into the pain, to save those they loved and to save their communities. And yet it was not just their desire to protect that left the Odravens stunned. It was the unwavering hope. The belief that, no matter the odds, they could make a difference, that they could still fight for each other even as the world around them crumbled. The Odravens' perception of humanity had begun to shift. They had expected the plague to break the humans, to force them into a fight for survival at the expense of one another. But instead, they'd witnessed humanity's most remarkable strength, the ability to endure suffering for the sake of love, for the sake of community. It was something the Odravens could never fully comprehend, and it left them with an unsettling realization. Humans would always fight, no matter the cost. They would fight, not for survival alone, but for each other. As the plague ravaged human colonies, the Odravens found themselves at a crossroads. The experiment they had set in motion was meant to prove the limits of human attachment, but what they were witnessing now was something far more profound. Humans were not just surviving. They were transcending the boundaries of survival itself. Their willingness to sacrifice for each other, to fight even when all hope seemed lost, was unlike anything the Odravens had anticipated. But there was still one final test they needed to conduct, something to determine whether the human spirit could endure a true breaking point. The Odravens had watched as Jace and Emily worked tirelessly to help those around them, even as Emily's health deteriorated. Despite the worsening conditions, Jace continued to fight alongside the other survivors, leading expeditions to gather supplies and offer what little aid they could. The plague was taking its toll on humanity, but the resolve in their eyes, the way they clung to one another, was what the Odravens now found most fascinating. But the Odravens had a far darker plan in mind. They needed to see if the bonds between humans could survive a tragedy even greater than anything they had encountered. They weren't going to just test the limits of human endurance. They would shatter the very thing that made them strong. And so, the Odravens unleashed their final strike. They hacked into the communication systems of the human colonies and made a public announcement, one that would ripple across the galaxy with devastating consequences. They told humanity that the plague had no cure, that every human alive would inevitably succumb to the disease. There was no hope, no salvation. They were all going to die. The Odravens anticipated the devastation this announcement would cause. They expected chaos, despair, and a collapse of society. They thought that in the face of certain extinction, humans would turn on one another, that their bonds would disintegrate under the weight of their hopelessness. But what they didn't expect was this. Instead of giving in to despair, the human colonies rallied together. Governments crumbled, but communities didn't. Families that had been separated by the plague found each other again, clinging to whatever shred of hope they could hold on to. Volunteers flooded the quarantine zones, offering their help, even when the likelihood of survival was slim. The world's greatest minds, who had once been focused on advancing technology, now worked tirelessly to develop any kind of cure, no matter how hopeless the odds. They didn't stop, because stopping meant abandoning those they loved. Jace and Emily, in their last moments, continued to push forward. Emily's condition worsened rapidly, but Jace refused to leave her side. He held her hand, whispered reassurances, and promised that they would face the end together. He made no attempt to save himself, as he had done before. He was not fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting to be with her, in whatever moments they had left. But then something happened that neither Jace nor the O'Drivens could have predicted. Emily's condition stabilized. It wasn't a cure, but a temporary reprieve. The O'Drivens, watching from the shadows, could hardly believe it. The human body, fragile and susceptible, had begun to show signs of resistance. Was this an accident, or was it something more? The O'Drivens had tampered with everything, engineered the plague to be insurmountable, but the humans were defying the odds once again. As the months passed, small victories emerged. New treatments were developed. Survivors, many of whom had previously been given up for dead, began to recover. Though the world had been left broken and battered, the human spirit seemed unbreakable. They refused to let the plague be the end of them. The O'Drivens were stunned. They had never encountered a species that could withstand so much, that could lose everything and still find the strength to rebuild. The experiment had not gone as they had planned. They had hoped to prove that humanity's greatest weakness was its connections to others, that when forced to face their own extinction, humans would crumble. Instead, they had discovered that love, sacrifice, and the desire to protect one another were not weaknesses. They were humanity's greatest strength. The O'Drivens had watched humanity struggle with a mixture of awe and disbelief. They had expected the human spirit to break under the strain of the plague, to see selfishness and despair overtake the collective will. But they had witnessed the opposite. Humanity's resilience had only grown stronger. Communities came together. People worked tirelessly for one another's survival, and the bonds of love and loyalty deepened, even in the darkest hours. It was as if the more they were tested, the more they rose to the occasion. Jace and Emily's survival against all odds had become a symbol of humanity's defiance. The O'Drivens had underestimated the capacity of humans to endure suffering. But they still had one final question to answer. What happens when humanity is given the choice to end their suffering? Would they choose to live through the pain, or would they choose the comfort of oblivion? To find out, the O'Drivens devised their most complex manipulation yet. They activated a device embedded deep within the planet's core, a device that was capable of altering the very fabric of time and space itself. They sent a signal, broadcasting it across the human colonies, offering them a choice, a cure for the plague. But there was a cost. The cure would come with an irreversible consequence, the complete erasure of all memories of the loved ones they had lost. In essence, humanity could have salvation, but at the cost of the very thing they had fought so fiercely to protect, the bonds that made them human. The O'Drivens watched carefully as the message spread across the galaxy. They knew that the decision would not be easy. After all, the plague had taken millions of lives, and the temptation to erase the pain of loss would be enormous. Would humans choose to live, even if it meant forgetting the sacrifices and love that had defined their fight? Or would they choose the unbearable weight of their memories and the continued struggle for survival? Jace and Emily were among the first to hear the news. As Emily's health slowly recovered, the idea of a cure seemed like a miracle. Yet, the choice loomed over them. For Jace, the decision was simple. He had seen the cost of love and sacrifice. He knew that even if the cure could heal her, the memory of everything they had been through, the battles, the sacrifices, the moments of joy and pain, would vanish forever. Could he erase those memories? Could he truly forget the woman he loved and all the moments they had shared? Emily, on the other hand, wasn't so sure. The temptation of erasing the pain of loss, of moving forward without the heavy burden of grief, was strong. She had lost so many, and the thought of erasing the agony seemed like an escape. But deep down, she knew that the cost would be too great. To lose the memories of those she loved, to forget the very essence of what had made her fight so hard for survival, was something she couldn't accept. As the decision weighed heavily on them, the O'Drivens observed, curious to see if the humans would choose the cure or the memory of their connections. They had expected a universal desire to escape pain, but what they saw instead was a humanity unwilling to let go of the very thing that made them human. Love, loss, and memory were inseparable. The O'Drivens had been right about one thing. Humans did not fear death, but they feared losing each other. The moment of truth arrived. As Jace and Emily stood together, hands clasped, they made their decision. They would live, and they would carry the weight of their memories, no matter how painful. They understood now that the bonds they shared, the sacrifices they had made, were worth more than any cure could ever offer. And as the O'Drivens watched, they were left with one undeniable conclusion. Humanity's strength was not in its ability to survive. It was in its ability to love, to sacrifice, and to remember. The decision made by Jace and Emily reverberated across human society. It wasn't just their personal choice. It had become a symbol for the entire human race. Humanity, faced with the chance to escape the pain of loss and erase the memories of their loved ones, chose instead to embrace the weight of their experiences. They chose to endure, to remember, and to honor the sacrifices that had defined them. The O'Drivens, who had been observing this from the shadows, were left in stunned silence. They had expected humanity to seek comfort in oblivion, to choose survival over the emotional connections that had fueled their resistance. Instead, they witnessed something extraordinary, a species that, despite all the suffering, was willing to carry the burden of loss because it was what made them who they were. As the news of humanity's decision spread, the O'Drivens were forced to confront a reality they hadn't anticipated. The plague, though still a threat, was now no longer the primary focus of human existence. People had come to understand that survival wasn't the ultimate goal. It was how they lived, who they loved, and the connections they forged that mattered most. They had chosen to fight, not for themselves, but for each other. The O'Drivens had originally set out to study a species that feared death above all else. They had wanted to understand what drove humans to sacrifice so much for one another. But they now realized that the true answer was something far deeper than they could have ever imagined. Humans didn't fear death. They feared losing the ones they loved. They feared the idea of an existence without the people who gave their lives meaning. As weeks passed, humanity began to rebuild. Communities that had been shattered by the plague began to heal. The memories of the loved ones lost were honored, their sacrifices remembered. Monuments were erected, not just to commemorate the dead, but to celebrate the resilience of the living. The families, the friends, the strangers who had come together in the face of annihilation. It was as if the bond between them was stronger than ever before. Jace and Emily, though scared by the losses they had endured, became leaders in this new era. They shared their story with others, reminding people that love and sacrifice were not weaknesses but strengths. They led efforts to create new technologies that could help humanity thrive, not just survive. Their mission wasn't to erase the past, but to use it as a foundation to build a better future. But the O'Drivens weren't finished. They had learned much from humanity, but they had not yet understood the full scope of human potential. The experiment had taken an unexpected turn. The very bonds that had fascinated the O'Drivens had now become something they had to confront. They had underestimated humanity's capacity for growth, for healing, and for uniting even in the face of the most unimaginable horrors. The O'Drivens decided to make their presence known. They had watched long enough. They had seen what humans were capable of, and they had come to a realization. The humans were not the experiment. They were the ones being tested. The O'Drivens, for all their advanced knowledge, were now faced with the reality that their own understanding of strength, sacrifice, and connection was limited. The humans had shown them something that could not be replicated in their own species: the power of love, the power to rise above even the darkest of circumstances and rebuild from the ashes. As the O'Drivens made their move to reveal themselves to humanity, they did so with a new sense of respect. The experiment had been an eye-opening journey, but they knew now that the true test was not just about observing humanity's capacity for survival. It was about understanding the incredible strength of their hearts. And in that moment, the O'Drivens came to a shocking realization. They weren't the ones in control. The humans had been the ones guiding them all along. The O'Drivens' revelation marked a turning point in their understanding of humanity. They had come to the galaxy to study a species that they believed was driven solely by fear, the fear of death. But through their actions, humanity had shown them something far more profound. The human spirit was bound not by fear, but by love, sacrifice, and the unyielding desire to protect each other. The O'Drivens had expected to break them, to make them crumble under the weight of their deepest fears, but instead, humanity had proven that even in the darkest of times, they could rise together. The time had come for the O'Drivens to reveal themselves. They had watched humanity's growth, and it was now clear that the humans had become something far beyond what they had expected. The O'Drivens, once detached observers, now felt a deep respect for this species. They had witnessed the strongest of bonds forged between individuals, communities, and even entire civilizations. The humans had faced their greatest challenges head-on, and, in doing so, had shown the O'Drivens what true strength meant. It was not long before the O'Drivens, in their advanced ships, made their presence known to the humans. Their fleet appeared above Earth's atmosphere, hovering like dark shadows against the backdrop of a star-filled sky. The humans had already experienced so much, and now the O'Drivens were about to take the next step, meeting the species they had observed for so long. Jace and Emily, who had become leaders in the rebuilding efforts, were among the first to communicate with the O'Drivens. They were hesitant but hopeful, unsure of what the future might hold, yet ready to face it together. Humanity, after everything they had been through, had learned the value of facing the unknown, of confronting challenges head-on. Their willingness to continue, to love, to fight, these were the qualities that now defined them. The O'Drivens, speaking in a language that humans could understand, broadcast their message across the globe. They admitted their failure, confessing that they had tested humanity in ways no species should be subjected to. They had manipulated, observed, and caused suffering in an attempt to uncover the essence of human fear. But instead, they had learned that what humans truly feared was not death, but the loss of those they loved. What the O'Drivens had witnessed was a species capable of unbreakable bonds, unwavering courage, and an infinite capacity for love. Humans, the O'Driven leader's voice echoed across every communication channel. We have watched you. We have seen your strength, and we have learned something we never expected. You have taught us the true meaning of resilience. You are a species that does not fear death, but instead fears losing each other. And it is this love, this connection that makes you stronger than we ever thought possible. The O'Drivens, now acknowledging their miscalculations, offered a choice to humanity. They would help them rebuild, to offer knowledge and resources beyond what the humans had ever dreamed. They would extend an olive branch, not as conquerors, but as allies. The O'Drivens realized that what they had witnessed was not weakness, it was humanity's greatest strength. They wanted to be a part of that strength, not to dominate it, but to learn from it. The humans, after much deliberation, accepted the offer. Jace and Emily, standing side by side, knew that this moment would change everything. Humanity had not just survived, they had thrived. And now the universe was watching as they stepped into a new chapter of their existence, one where their love, their sacrifices, and their connections would guide them toward a future that no one, not even the O'Drivens, could have predicted. Together, humanity and the O'Drivens began to forge a new alliance, one built not on power, but on understanding. The legacy of humanity's heart had left an indelible mark on the universe, and the Odrivans, once cold and distant, now stood alongside them, humbled and ready to learn. The human spirit had triumphed, and the universe would never be the same.